We're on the bottom of Kufna and Dalet Amud Beis, and we were discussing the machlokas between Abai and Rava, whether there's a difference between tzdadim and sidei tzdadim. Now, we understand that the rabbis told us that we're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos. Comes along the Gemara at this point and says that even using the side of a tree is prohibited, but, says Abaya, using the side of a tree indirectly, which he calls sidei tzdadim, is going to be permitted. Rava disagrees, and he says no. If you hold that using the side of a tree is usher, then even doing that indirectly, called sidei tzdadim, will be usher. And if you hold that using the side of a tree is mutter, then even directly using the side of the tree is going to be mutter. So that's where we're up to now. Eisvei Rav Misharshia l'Rava. Rav Misharshia challenges Rava, who says that there's no difference between tzdadim and sidei tzdadim. It says in the Brisa, Noatz Yosei be'ilan v'tolaba kalkolo l'mayla me'asar t'fachem en eruve eruv l'matam yotfachem eruve eruv eruvo eruv. Now here we're talking about a person who would like to acquire a residence or a domain in a certain area that's outside of his normal tchum. So he's got to do something called an eruv tchumen, which is to take a parcel of food, deposit it in an area from before Shabbos, so that that parcel of food that is his acquires domain for him in that area. So he decides that he wants to acquire domain where there's a tree. So he takes a basket, fills it with food, and hangs the basket on a peg that's hanging out of the tree. So the Brisa says that it depends. If the basket is suspended above 10 tfachim, so then it's not a valid eruv tchumen. The reason is because if he wants to acquire domain in a public area, a reshus harabim, and that's going to be the epicenter of his domain, so then the food parcel has to be in a reshus harabim. If it's above 10 tfachim, and the basket itself is 4 tfachim wide, so then really the basket is its own reshus, it's a reshus hayachid, and therefore it's not part of the domain that he wishes to acquire. If however, the basket is below 10 tfachim, so then the basket has acquired domain for him, and therefore he's allowed to traverse this area that he had wanted to be in. The point of the exercise of this brisa is to demonstrate to us that he's hanging the basket on a hook that's coming out of the tree. So the Gemara says like this: Taima denoatz yosed be'ilan, holo noatz afilu lamata miyod tfachim ein eruvo eruv. So the whole reason why this is a valid positioning of his food parcel is because there was a peg coming out of the tree. But if he had directly tied the basket to the tree without the intermediary of the peg, then that would be illicit because he's directly using the side of the tree, and that also would invalidate the eruv. So the ha-haitana dekasa b'tzdadim v'kashari b'tzidei tzdadim. So I've just demonstrated for you, Rava, that there's a Tana who says that to use the side of the tree directly is prohibited, but to use the side of the tree indirectly via a peg is permitted. So your thesis that whenever using the side of the tree is usher, it's even usher using it indirectly, is disproved. That's the point. Amar Rav Papa, so Rav Papa defends Rava, and he says, no, hacha bekalkala dechuka askinan devahadi deshakole le'eruv kamanaded kamanid le le'ilan the kamishamish be'ilan gufe. Rav Papa says that no, really it could be that that both using the side of the tree directly and indirectly is permitted according to this Tana. And the reason why it's problematic if the basket is tied directly to the tree without the intermediary of the peg is not because of the prohibition of using the side of the tree, but is rather because we're dealing with a basket that the mouth of the basket is so small that anytime you try to get food in and out of the basket, you're invariably going to have to move the basket vigorously, which will also require you to shake the tree. And the reason why the rabbi said that it's not a good eruv is because you won't be able to access the food without moving the tree, and you're not allowed to move a tree on Shabbos. So that's the reason why. not because you're not allowed to utilize the side of the tree, but because you're going to be shaking the tree by accessing the food. So really you have no proof from here to a way to disprove Rabbi's thesis. But despite that argument, the Hilchas Tzdadim Asur and Sidei Tzdadim Mutar, and the Gemara's conclusion is that to use the side of a tree directly is Asur, but to use it indirectly, use via a hook, like we talked about the hammock yesterday, that would be permitted. Amar Avashi Hashta de Amar Tzdadim Asurin Hai Darga de Midla La Linchi Inish Adikla de Havaluhu Tzdadim. Rav Ashi says, now that we know that you're not allowed to utilize the side of a tree, when a person has a fort that he would like to go up, and Rashi describes this as sort of like a watchtower, that it's a platform that's built upon 4 long pegs, 4 long sticks, 4 long posts, and you have to climb up this watchtower via a ladder, and typically this is adjacent to a tree. So a person would typically prop up the ladder against the tree just to keep it as a place where he could access the ladder. The problem is, however, by utilizing the ladder, by pulling it off of the tree, you're benefiting from the side of the tree. So therefore, a person should not place the ladder by on the tree, the Havalut Stadim, because you're getting benefit from the tree. Elalinche agavazi lebar midikla. But rather, what you should do is you should insert a hook into the tree, and then you could put the ladder on the hook. And that way, you're not using the side of the tree directly. You're using the side of the tree indirectly. The chisalik lo linach kare agavazi ela lisnach akanin. And furthermore, if you want to come down the fort and you want to find your footing before you start stepping on the ladder, you should not put your foot on the hook that's coming out of the tree, because that would be utilizing the side of the tree directly. But instead, what you should do is you should put your foot on the protruding sticks that are coming out from the platform of the lookout tower, and in that way you'll be able to find your footing and get down from the lookout tower.
Or you're taking the ladder's leaning on the side of the tree, and you're removing it.
Either removing it or putting it back on the tree.
I can understand, but once you remove it,
you could argue it's arguable. It's arguable. You could say I'm benefiting from the side of the tree even by just pulling it off, because I don't have to pick it up from the ground. So I'm not really sure, but certainly to put it against the tree would be us.
And the branches of the tree are the same as the trunk of the tree, considered?
Branches are the same as the trunk, exactly. So this, from the way Rashi describes it, this lookout tower is not attached to the tree; it's adjacent to the tree. Next Mishnah. Now the topic of the Mishnah is what kind of tircha are you allowed to do in order to feed animals on Shabbos. So there's a little bit of technical stuff that we have to get through here, and some of it's going to be foreign because none of us are farmers. So anyway, matirin pekiye amir lifnei behema umefastasin es hakipin avaloes azirin. So the Mishnah says that you're allowed to undo bundles of hay on Shabbos in order to feed your animal, and furthermore you're allowed to spread out the hay in order to make it more appetizing for your animal. And you're allowed to do that with kippin. Now, what kippin are and how they're different from pekiyin is something that the Gemara will discuss. Avaloes azirin, but you're not allowed to do that with zirin. And what that means, these are all terms that the Gemara has yet to define. But it is some kind of animal fodder. Next, ein meraskin loes hashachas veloes hacharuvin lifnei behema bein daka uvein gasa. You're not allowed to chop up wheatgrass or alfalfa. That's how they translate shachas. You're not allowed to chop it up, and nor are you allowed to chop up carob in front of an animal, and it makes no difference whether the animal is large or small. However, Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin ladaka. Rabbi Yehuda says that for a small animal like a goat or a sheep, it is permissible to chop up carob, apparently because it's difficult for the animal to eat it unless you chop it. So let's take a look at the Gemara now. We're going to see now a machlokes in how to interpret this Mishnah between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. Amar Rav Huna, hein pekiyin, hein kippin. That the word pekian and keepin are exactly the same thing. They're both bundles of hay. The difference between the two of them is that pekian tray and keepin tlasa. A pekia is a bundle of hay that has two rings or two ties around it, and a kippah is a bundle of hay that has three ties around it. So they're essentially the same thing. And zirin, what are zirin that are discussed in the Mishnah? That's not hay at all, but that's rather a bundle of cedar branches that are soft enough because they're young branches, freshly grown branches that are tender enough for an animal to chew on. So v'hachi ka'amar, matirin pekiye amir lifnei behema umefasfasin v'hu adin lekipin. That the way that I understand the Mishnah is that you're allowed to untie bundles of hay and spread them out, and you can do the same thing with keepin, which are also bundles of hay with three rings around them. In both cases, that's perfectly fine. Avoloas azirin lo lefasfes v'lo lahatir. The only thing you're not allowed to do on Shabbos is you're not allowed to untie bundles of cedar branches. Now, what's the reason? So, Amar Reb Chizda, my time of the Ravuna, kasar v'lemitrach b'uchla tarchinan l'shvuye uchla lo mashvina. It's because Ravuna is of the opinion that you're allowed to do whatever you need to do in order to make the food appetizing for your animal. And what Ravuna is essentially arguing is that even if you didn't do that extra step of exertion, the animal would still eat the food, but it wouldn't be as appetizing for the animal. That's okay. Do what you need to do to make sure that your animal gets the nutrition by making the food even more appealing to the animal. That's perfectly okay on Shabbos. But here's what the Mishnah is telling you that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to take something that was not explicitly designated for food, for fodder, for animal fodder on Shabbos, I'm saying before Shabbos, and turn it into animal fodder on Shabbos. That you're not allowed to do because you're sort of creating something new on Shabbos. Now, cedar branches is not automatically designated as animal fodder. So by you going ahead and sort of turning it into animal fodder by untying the branches and spreading them out in front of your animal, that's what the Mishnah finds objectionable, because you're creating new fodder where there previously was none before. That's Rav Huna's sheet. Okay? Now Rav Yehuda has a totally opposite way of looking at the Mishnah. Rav Yehuda Amar, hein hein pekian, hein hein zirin. Pekian trey, zirin tlasa. He says no. The two synonyms of the Mishnah are not pekian and keepin, but rather pekian and zirin. The two of them are talking about bundles of hay. One has two rings around it. One has three rings or three ties around it. And keepin da'arzi. Keepin is the word that is a reference to cedar branches. And v'hachi ka'amar, matirin pekiye amir lifnei behema avol pispuse lo. That you're allowed to untie bundles of hay in front of an animal, but what you're not allowed to do is do the extra exertion of spreading it out. And the reason is because when you untie hay in front of an animal, the hay is now edible for the animal. It may not be as appetizing for the animal. Like Rashi explains, by spreading it out, you make sure that its aroma gets more into the animal's nose, and it's more appetizing, I guess, from I don't know, I'm not an animal, but it's more appetizing if the hay is spread out than if it smells better than if it's in a bundle. Okay? So you're only allowed to untie it to render it edible, but you can't do the extra exertion of spreading it out to make it more appetizing. The keepin pispuse nami mefaspasinan, and when it comes to keepin, you're also allowed to spread that out. And remember, what are keepin? Keepin are those cedar branches. And the reason you're allowed to spread them out is because otherwise the animal won't eat them at all, because they're not going to be usable for food. The only thing that you're not allowed to do is avalo hasirin lefasfes elalahatir. The thing is, with zirin, which are also bundles of hay, just like we said before, you're not allowed to spread them out. You're only allowed to open the bundles. It's the same thing as with zirin. You can only spread them. You're only allowed to open up the bundles. You're not allowed to spread them out. And there's a girsa change here from the Rif that the Grub brings down, but we'll learn like Rashi's girsa over here, is that zirin and pekian are the same thing. They're bundles of hay, You can just untie them, but you can't spread them out because we don't allow you to do any extra tircha. Says Rav Yehuda, I've got no problem with you rendering cedar branches edible on Shabbos. That's not the issue. The issue is the extra tircha, the extra exertion. So Amar Rava, my time with the Rav Yehuda, K'savar Shivuye Uchla Mashvinan, Mitrach B'Uchla Lo Tarchin. That's what I just spoke out. There's no problem, says Rav Yehuda, to convert something into an edible fodder on Shabbos. But what is objectionable to the Mishnah is the extra exertion to make it more appetizing. So Tanan. So now let's look at the next part of the Mishnah and see how it works out. Ein meraskinas ashachas desacharuvin lifnei behema bein dako vein gasa. That you're not allowed to chop up the wheatgrass and the carob in front of an animal. Makes no difference whether it's a large or small animal on Shabbos. So my lav chruvin dumya deshachas. Ma shachas derechichi af charuvin derechichi. Alma lo tarchinan be'uchlo tiyufta de Ravuna. So the challenge that we want to bring to Ravuna is as follows. You see from the second part of the Mishnah that the reason why you're not allowed to chop up these items, and the assumption is that the carob is just like the wheatgrass. Just like wheatgrass is soft and edible, so too the carob is soft and edible. And the only thing that you're not allowed to do is chop it up. Why? Because since it's edible already to the animal before you chop it up, we don't allow you to take the extra step of making it more appetizing for the animal, since it's already edible. So you see that Rav Huna is mistaken, because if Rav Huna was correct that you're allowed to do the extra step of exertion, then why wouldn't you be allowed to chop up these items? So the Gemara says, Amar Lacha Rav Huna, lo, shachas dumya de charuvin, machruvin de akushi, av shachas de akushi. So Rav Huna says, no, you got it wrong. That's not what the Mishnah is talking about. The Mishnah is talking about wheatgrass and carob that are both hard, and they're not really edible to the animal. And therefore, your chopping them up is rendering them into an edible product. And that's what the Mishnah finds objectionable, because you're not allowed to turn something that was previously inedible into an edible product on Shabbos. So, heichi mishkachas la bi'ili zutri. And what would be the case if you're dealing with very small young donkeys who have difficulty chewing? For them, that kind of grass and that kind of carob is completely inedible until you chop it up. And that's the reason why the Mishnah says you can't do it. But if something was already fodder and you just want to make it more appetizing, Rav Huna says the Mishnah would have no problem with that. So Tashma. But now let's look at the next part of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda mater b'charuvin ladaka, ladaka in lagasalo. So Rabbi Yehuda was the last part of our Mishnah, and he says that you're allowed to chop up carob for a small animal. Only for a small animal, of course, but not for a large animal, because a large animal can eat it without chopping it up. So, Iyomart bishla matanakama savra mitrach beuchla lo tarchinan shivoy mashvinan hainu deka amar Rabbi Yehuda charuvin ladaka nami shivoy uchlahu. So he says, if you're going to tell me that the objection that the Mishnah has is to do extra exertion, and that's the problem, so then it works out well why Rabbi Yehuda argues, and he says, you know what? The only thing that I hold that you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to do extra tircha, but you're allowed to convert something into a food item. So comes along Rabbi Yehuda, and he says that when you chop up carob, you're also making it edible, and therefore I hold that you're allowed to chop it up for a small animal. It's not called extra tircha, it's called making it edible, and that's why I hold it's okay. So you see that this is a support to Rav Yehuda, who says that making something edible for the first time on Shabbos is what you are allowed to do, but what you're not allowed to do is to do the extra tircha. Eliyomar tanakama sarva shivoy uchla lo mashvinan, mitrach be'uchla matrachinan. So Rabbi Yehuda demater b'charuvin ladaka kol shekain lagasa. Ladaka, question mark, kol shekain lagasa, exclamation point. He says, if you're going to say, like Rav Huna says, that the Tanakama holds that you're not allowed to render something into an edible product on Shabbos, but you're allowed to take an already edible product and make it more appetizing for the animal. So when it says that Rav Yehuda permits you to chop it up for a small animal, so even more so. So he says, if the whole issue is that you're taking an edible product and making it more appetizing, so to which kind of animal is this product more edible? Is it more edible to a behema gasa or to a behema daka? It would be more edible to a behema gasa. So it should surely be that permitted. If you're allowed to chop it up for a behema daka to make it more appetizing, then surely you're allowed to chop it up for a behema gasa to make it more appetizing. Because remember, according to the way that Rav Huna understands the Mishnah, you're only allowed to chop up something which is already edible. So if it's edible for a behema daka, then it's surely edible for a behema gasa. So that's our question. How does Rav Huna reconcile this last line of the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, no, you made a mistake in your understanding of what the word behema daka means. Mi savris daka daka mamish? No. My daka gasa, ve'amai kori la daka, the daika ba'uchlo. A little bit of a stretch. The Gemara says that the word behema daka in Rabbi Yehuda's statement does not mean a small animal. It means a really big animal that already uses this as fodder even without chopping it up. So why are you allowed to chop it up for this animal? To make it more appetizing. So then why did you call this cow a behema daka? The word daka here doesn't mean small animal. It means an animal that is very discriminating in how it chews its food. It chews its food very thoroughly. So the word daka means dayaka. It's very careful to chew its food very, very carefully, and therefore you want to make it more appetizing for such an animal because it likes to chew its food very well and have a very chewy food, so therefore you want to cut it into smaller pieces. This is a very contrived answer. So the Gemara is going to actually tell us, but wait a minute, come on, get real. Hamid ketani reisha bein dako vein gasa michal de Rabbi Yehuda daka daka mamish ka'amar. The very fact that the previous statement of the Tana Kama is that you're not allowed to chop this up either for a behema daka or for a behema gasa, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can chop it up for a behema daka, means that the word behema daka is not talking about an animal who chews well. It's a contradistinction to behema gasa. So therefore, don't tell me that that's the behema daka doesn't mean behema daka over here. The Gemara says you're right. That's a kasha. We're going to end up with a problem with Rav Huna in our Mishnah. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's look at the flip side. Tashma, we have another Mishnah which says, "Mechaschin es hadluin lifnei habehema, v'sanavela lifnei haklavim," that you're allowed to chop up on Yantiv pumpkins in front of an animal for the animal to eat, and you can chop up carrion meat, nevela meat, which is not kosher for human consumption, but you can feed it to your animals. You're allowed to chop that up on Yantiv. So my lav deluin dumyan de nevela, my nevela de rechicha, afdelun de rechicha, alma tarchinin be'uchlo to the Rav Yehuda. The very fact that the Mishnah compares pumpkins to carcass meat is an indication that just like carcass meat is edible to an animal in its current state because it's soft, so too the pumpkins must be soft. And what we allow you to do is take something which is already an edible food and make it more appetizing. So this is a proof to Rav Huna and a kasha on Rav Yehuda, who says you're not allowed to do that extra tircha. So the Gemara says, Amar lacha Rav Yehuda lo, nevela dumya de deluin, ma deluin da ashuni, af nevela da ashuna. So he says, no, you misunderstood. When the Mishnah compares pumpkins to nevela meat, it's saying that the nevela meat is as tough and difficult to eat for the animal as the pumpkin is. And the reason you have to chop it up is because if you didn't chop it up, neither of them would be edible. So you're rendering it into a food, and that's what the Mishnah permits. So ve'echi mishkachas la b'basar pili. So what kind of nevela meat is not edible until you chop it up? Well, let's say you find an animal carcass in your backyard one Yantif morning. You walk outside your backyard and see a dead elephant outside. So you want to feed it to your dogs. The only way that your dogs are going to be able to eat a dead elephant is if you chop it up. Otherwise, there's just no other way. What's so funny? It happens all the time.
Maybe you could boil it.
Okay. Anyway. Yeah. Inami. Alternatively, says the Gemara, the guriyasa zutri. Or we could be talking about little chihuahuas, little tiny dogs, that even with regular carrion meat, even with regular nevela meat, even if it's not elephant meat, these dogs are so tiny and little cute, little adorable little rodents that they can't eat the meat until you chop it up for them, and that's why you're allowed to chop it up according to Rav Yehuda. Anyway, Tashma Datani Rav Chanan Minaharda V'farchinon tevin v'yaspasta uma'arvin. We have a brisa that says that you're allowed to break apart hay and alfalfa and mix them together on Shabbos. So alma tarchinon b'uchlas. So you see, once again, you're allowed to take something which is already edible and make it more appetizing for an animal. So again, it's a support for ravana. So the Gemara now says no, not necessarily, because we could be talking about hay that is inedible before you break it up. It could be like a sour kind of hay that's starting to go bad, and you therefore need to chop it up so that the animal will eat it. And aspasta be'ili zutri, and again, like we said, we're talking about alfalfa or wheatgrass that you want to feed to young donkeys who will not eat it unless it's not considered a food until you render it by chopping it up. So anyway, the Gemara basically says you have proofs for Rav Huna, you have proofs for Rav Yehuda. We don't have a resolution on this. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. This Mishnah is also a little bit confusing because we're using terminology that we have to define. We won't be able to define the terminology. Here the Mishnah is talking about what kind of force feeding are you allowed to do to an animal on Shabbos. It was desirable many times to force feed an animal, either to fatten it up, or let's say you were going on a long trip with your camel, you would want to force feed a camel so that it would have enough nutrition in its belly to sustain it on a long journey when you knew you weren't going to be able to find a 7-Eleven on the road. So, ein obsin es hagamal velo dorsin, that you're not allowed to do obsin, which is a form of force feeding, nor are you allowed to do this kind of force feeding which is called dorsin, which is a lesser form of forcing it. And the Gemara will have to define for us what the difference between the two is. Rashi just says you push the grain into its throat, but not as forcefully as obsin. But anyway,
doing all this on Shabbos,
we're talking about on Shabbos.
A Jewish mother.
It doesn't sound very Sar Balachayim.
Oh, Sar Balachayim, apparently it's not, and I don't know if the Gemara is going to deal with that on the next stop, but today we won't see that. Now, as far as calves, you're allowed to be mal'itin, which is the same word that Yoseph said, hal iteni na meha adama adama zeh. Give me to eat. You're allowed to do some kind of force feeding with calves, but you're not allowed to do what's called ma'amirin. We don't know what the difference between the two. The Gemara will define for us. Avol mal'itin u'mahalketin l'tarnagolim, but you are allowed to do both the act of mal'itin and you're allowed to do the act of mahalketin for chickens. And vinostin mayim lemursan, and you're allowed to put water and mix it with and add it to bran to make it into animal feed. Avolo govlan, but you're not allowed to mix it and make it into a dough. Ve'enostin mayim lifnei dvorim lifnei yonim shebeshovach, and furthermore, you're not allowed to put water in front of bees or in front of doves in a dove coop on Shabbos. The reason, as we'll see, is because these animals can sustain themselves without you doing that, so we don't allow you to do that extra tircha. Avonosin lifnei avozim v'tarnagolim v'lifnei yonei hardisios, but you are allowed to put water in front of geese and chickens and domesticated doves, because these animals depend upon you for their sustenance. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Mayin obsin. What does it mean that obsin is prohibited? Amar Rav Yehuda, ein losin la evus b'soch me'eha. That you're not allowed to force feed the animal so much that it becomes a trough worth of food inside its stomach. So the Gemara now says, mi ika ki haigavna. Since when can you fit so much food inside an animal's stomach? Just talk to someone at one of our kiddushes. The Gemara says, Uchida amar Rav Yirmiyah midifti lididi chazili hahutaya da'achla kura va'atina kura. He says, yes, I once saw an Arab feed an entire core of grain to a camel and then put another core of grain on its back for the road. And they would typically do this because if you would travel long distances with a camel, you'd want to force feed it so that it would have enough sustenance to endure the long trip. So, and then we said, ein ma'amirin. First we said you're not allowed to do obsin, you're not allowed to do dorsin with a camel. You're not allowed to, but you are allowed to do mal'itin. And then we said that you're not allowed to do ma'amirin with calves. So what is ma'amirin? So what is that word ma'amirin? So ezuhi hamra'a. So ve'ezuhi hal'ata. We said you're not allowed to do ma'amirin, but you're allowed to do mal'itin. So what's the difference between the two? So here we have a machlokes. Amar Rav Yehuda, hamra'a l'makam sheni yechol lahachzir, halata l'makam sheyechol lahachzir. That the term hamra'a is a force feeding where you put the food so far down in its gullet or its throat that it can't. There's no gag reaction that it can force it back out. The animal can't spit it out because you put it down too far in its throat. And halata is where you're not pushing it down so far, so it's more of a permitted act. There's less tircha. The animal can still spit it out if it wants to, and that's what's permitted. So Rav Chisda Amar, I disagree, says Rav Chisda. He says, Idi v'idi l'makom sheni yechol lahachzir. Both acts are where the animal cannot get it out once you put it that far down. V'hamra'a b'chli hal'ata b'yad. And the only difference between the two is that hamra'a is more of a tircha because you're doing a much more vigorous act because you're using a utensil. And hal'ata is a less ambitious act because you're doing it by hand, so you're not pushing down as much. And that's what we permit. We permit hal'ata by hand, but we don't permit hamra'a, which is using a utensil. So Masav Rav Yosef. So now Rav Yosef is going to challenge this. Now let's just go back and look. What did we say that you're allowed to do with chickens? You're allowed to do mal'itin and a mahalkitin. Now mal'itin is a permissible act for calves, for animals. And furthermore, it says you're allowed to do mahalkitin in addition to that. So now there is a brisa that talks about mahalkitin as well, which seems to be less than malitin. And now we're going to break down mahalkitin into two separate categories. Mahalkitin l'tarnagolin vein sarach lomer shemalkitin ve'ein malkitin liyonei shovach u'liyonei aliyah vein sarach lomer she'ein mahalkitin. So it says that for chickens that are your responsibility to feed, you're both allowed to do this act of mahalkitin and malkitin, which is a lesser act. But when it comes to doves that can get their sustenance from the wild, so those you're not allowed to do the lesser act of malkitin, and certainly not the more strenuous act of mahalkitin. So now the question is, my mahalkitin or my malkitin? Ilema mahalkitin desafile biyadayim. So one option is to say that mahalkitin means that you give the animal to eat with your hands, just like malitin we said was giving the animal to eat with your hands. So then malkitin, the lesser act, which is malkitin, which is not mentioned by our Mishnah, would mean that you're putting it down on the ground in front of the animal. The shadi le kamayu michlal. So by inference, the yone shovach, the yone aliyah, mishta kamayu nami lo. You mean to tell me that you can't even put food in front of doves? What's the possible problem? You're not. What kind of tircha are you doing? There's nothing wrong that you're doing. So elalavs, you have to say like this, that mahalkitin is l'makom she'eni yachol lahachzir, and malkitin is l'makom she'yachol lahachzir. So you have to conclude like this, that the word mahalkitin that's used by both the Mishnah and the Brisa is to force feed it by putting it in a place so far down in its throat where it can't spit it back out. And therefore malkitin is a place where it could spit it out. Michlal da hamra'a b'chli. And therefore, it turns out that the word ma'amirin, which is the thing that you're not allowed to do for a behema, we said that you're not allowed to do ma'amirin, but you're allowed to do mahalkitin. So ma'amirin means using a kli, and a mahalkitin is force feeding it by using a hand, but getting it down to where it can't spit it out. So this is a proof to Rav Chisda and against Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda was the one who said that Rav Yehuda was the one that says Hamra'a l'makam sheni yachol lahachzir and hal'at l'makam sheyachol lahachzir. He had said that mal'itin is to getting it to a place where it can't spit it back. But mahalkitin, where it can spit it out. But if mahalkitin is the lesser act, and we're concluding that it's also you put it down so far that it can't spit it out, so then that shows that Rav Yehuda is mistaken. So Amar Lacha Rav Yehuda, no. La'ola mahalkitin desafi le biyadayim, and malkitin deshadi le kamayu. So Rav Yehuda will explain to you as follows. No. Mahalkitin also is that you force feed it, but it could still spit it out. And so what is malkitin, which is even less than that? Malkitin means that you just put it in front of him. You put it in front of the animal. And why are you not allowed to do that with doves? Why is that problematic? The answer is that hani mizonosan alecha, v'hani ein mizonosan alecha. The answer is that even to put feed in front of a bird, if it's not your responsibility to feed that bird because it can take care of itself, we don't even allow you to do that. Because since it's not your responsible to feed the bird, then even the tircha of just putting bird feed in front of an animal is asur on Shabbos. Kidatanya, as the Brisa says, nosnin mizonos lifnei kelev, ve'enosnin mizonos lifnei chazir. As the Brisa says, you're allowed to put fruit in front of a dog on Shabbos, but you're not allowed to put food in front of a pig on Shabbos. So, uma hefresh bein zelazeh, what's the difference between a dog and a pig? Answers the Gemara, zeh mizonosav alecha, v'zeh ein mizonosav alecha. The answer is because a dog you're allowed to have as a pet, and therefore as your pet you have an obligation to feed it. But a Jew is not allowed to own a pig. It says that your Jew is not allowed to raise pigs. And so therefore this pig that you're feeding, that's not your responsibility. And because it's not your responsibility, it's usher for you to feed it on Shabbos. Amar Avashi masnisa namidika. We can infer that from the Mishnah as well, because it says Einostin ma'im lifnei devorim lifnei yonim shebeshovach, aval nostin lifnei avosim lifnei tarnagolim lifnei yonei hardisios. That it says even to put water in front of bees and in front of doves that are in a dove coop, you're not allowed to do. You're only allowed to do that for domesticated birds that are on your farm. So my time, alav mishum dahani mizonos on olecha, v'hani em mizonos on olecha. That must be, the reason is because one is a creature that can fend for itself, like bees and doves that land in your dove coop, and the other ones are birds that can't fend for themselves. They rely upon you for their sustenance, and therefore you see that even to put food or water in front of them is asur on Shabbos if they're not your responsibility. So frak the Gemara v'litai mech my irya maya afilu chiti v'sari nami lo. So the Gemara says, well then, why does the Mishnah only say that you can't put water in front of bees and doves? Let it say you can't put any food in front of them. So the Gemara answer is, Eloshayni Maya d'shchicha ba'agma. The answer is because when it comes to grain, you have to worry that a dove in a dove coop may not find grain outside in the wild. So that we permit you to do because you want to be able to domesticate or keep these doves and have them come to your dove coop so that you can utilize them. So that's why you're allowed to put grain in front of them. But water, they can easily find water by flying out into the swamp that's beyond your property. And since these animals do fly back and forth from the dove coop out into the forest, you have an obligation. You're not permitted to give them water to drink because they can fend for water for themselves. Darash Rabbi Yona apischa devei nesiya. He gave the following homiletic drush. It says, "My dechsiv tzadik din dalim." That what does the pasuk mean when it talks about God and says that God is righteous in the way that He judges the lowly? Answers the Gemara, Yodei HaKadosh Baruch Hu bekelev shemizonosav mu'atim lefichach shoachilaso b'meyav gimel yamim. That God knows that dogs have limited diets, that dogs have limited access to food. And as a result, Hashem is compassionate with the biology of a dog, such that it takes 3 days for a dog to digest its food properly. Why is that? That's an act of charity from Hashem, because it takes so long to digest the food that a dog can go longer distances without meals. Kiditnan kama tisha achilasu b'meya v'yetame b'kelev gimel yamim me'es la'es uvaofos v'dagin kedei shetipo la'or v'tisarif. And this is demonstrated by a halach in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if a dog swallows a piece of corpse meat, then the corpse meat is still considered to be intact for a full 72 hours from the time that the dog swallows it, such that if the dog were to die and then be inside a house, then since the corpse meat is still intact inside the dog's stomach, the tumah of that corpse meat is transmitted throughout the house. Whereas, by contrast, by a bird or a fish, if you feed a bird or a fish any kind of food, including a piece of corpse material, it's considered to be almost immediately digested once it swallows it. The time that it takes for something to combust is the time that it takes for this piece of material to be considered to be digested by the bird or the fish. So you see that the digestion process with a bird or a fish is much more rapid than it is with a dog. So you see from here, you see from this drasha, that it's considered to be proper derech eretz, proper charity, proper ethics, to give a piece of meat to a dog, because in all likelihood a dog hasn't had a good meal in a long time. Rashi explains that people are not as compassionate to dogs the way we are today. People look at a dog and they say, oh, what a cute puppy, and they give it, they overfeed it, and they go and spend thousands of dollars on in the grocery store on dog food. Back in the day, you saw a dog and you distanced yourself from it. You won't have anything to do with it, but it's still derech eretz. Give a dog something to eat because you can assume that he's hungry. Bekama Amar Rav Mori Meshach Udne v'chutra basre. He says, but even then, when you're compassionate to a dog, grab its ear and give it a piece of meat, and then have a stick to be ready to whack it so that it'll run away from you. You don't want a dog to hang around you for too long. And honey mili bedavravo b'masalo de asula misrach. And furthermore, it's only good to give a dog a piece of meat when you're out in the wilderness. But if you see a dog coming to your house, don't feed it, because you feed it one day, it's going to come back for the rest of your life. Amar Rav Papa leis da'anya mikalba v'les da'asr mechazira. There is no animal that is poorer than a dog, and no animal that is richer than a pig, because a dog has difficulty finding its meals, and a pig has no problem. He just has to look in front of him, and there's his next meal. Pigs eat anything. Tanya Kavase the Rav Yehuda, and finally we have a brisa to support Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda had said that the only thing that's permitted is to force feed it to a point in its throat where it could still spit it out, but you're not allowed to force feed it to a point where it can't spit it out anymore. So and the brisa says just like that. It says Ezuhi hamra'a ve'ezuhi hal'ata. What are those two verbs? Hamra'a marbitza upokes ispiha umachila. Karshina numayim bevasachas. That hamra'a is where you sit the animal down, you prop open its mouth to keep it open, and then you force feed it with cress and water all together, pushing it down. And hal'ata, but hal'ata is machila ma'umad, umashka ma'umad, v'noskin karshina bifnei atzman, umayim bifnei atzman. But hal'ata is not that level of force feeding, but instead you can only feed the animal while it's still standing, so that you can't get that far down into its gullet, into its throat, and you can only feed it cress separately and water separately, because the animal has to still have the ability to sort of spit it out if it doesn't want it. So this brisa is indicative of Rav Yehuda's distinction between getting it down to a point where it could still spit it out versus getting it down to a point where it can't spit it out anymore. We'll have to hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.